Good evening, everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of Discourse, an archive of ideas. This initiative of the Economic Society of Shri College of Commerce is aimed at broadening the perspective of students on policy matters and other contemporary issues. Today, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Deepak Mishra, who currently serves as the Professor of Economics at the Center for the Study of Regional Development at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Having pursued a PhD in economics, Sir specializes in fields like political economy of agrarian change, migration, and human development. A recipient of the Sanjay Thakur Young Labour Economist Award, Dr. Mishra has displayed his prowess in the field of economics through his research papers and collaborations with prestigious institutions. He has also been a team member at the Oxford University project on resource greenhouse gases, technology, and jobs in the in India's informal economy, the case of rice. Having authored and co-authored some venerated journals and books, including the likes of The Unfolding Crisis in Assam's Tea Plantations, Employment and Occupational Mobility, Internal Migration in Contemporary India, and Rethinking Economic Development in Northeast India, The Changing Dynamic, he has provided insightful analysis of the state of affairs set in the contemporary backdrop set in the backdrop of the contemporary economy. Sir, it's an honor for us to interact with academics such as yourself who consistently push us to question and critique policies that are meant to enhance public welfare. Today's discussion will revolve around one of the topics Sir has devoted a lot of his works to, and we are sure to reap gainful insights from the session. Migrant worker crisis in the light of agriculture has been under intense discussion lately due to the pandemic and the seasonal nature of work opportunities in the country. Business closures and restrictions to movement, combined with limited access to all forms of social protection, have increased migrants' vulnerability to poverty and food and nutrition insecurity. With Sir's learned insights, we hope all of us will have something to take back from the session and will gain a better understanding of the migrant worker crisis in the country, which was further exacerbated by the pandemic. Before I hand it over to Dr. Mishra, kindly note that all the participants are requested to remain muted during the session and can put any and all questions they might have for Sir in the chat box. These questions will be taken up post the session. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Sir to share his insights.
Thank you. Good evening to you all. And let me start with expressing my gratitude to the Economic Society of SRCC for giving me this opportunity to be part of this conversation. We are going to talk about migrant workers in the context of broad changes in the political economy of agriculture in India, which of course is a very widely discussed topic. Let me start by saying that I'll be talking about migration as a process, but my focus will be on vulnerable migrants who I think should be at the center of policy making in relation to migration in India. Let me start by sharing my screen. Let me see. Am I audible clearly?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Okay. Let me just start.
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, sir, the screen is
Okay,
visible.
thank you. So, vulnerable migrants in India, rethinking the agrarian linkages. It took a pandemic, a humanitarian crisis of this magnitude, to make migrant workers visible in policy circles. For generations, researchers working on migrant workers have been pointing out the inadequacy of the information that we have as a country, as an economy, about migrant workers. The statistical invisibility is not just a matter of bureaucratic inefficiency. India's statistical system, as you know, is considered as one of the most robust in the developing world. Rather, the statistical invisibility of migrant workers and the resultant policy invisibility is linked with the political powerlessness, voicelessness of migrant workers. By walking down on the roads of India during the pandemic, post-lockdown, migrant workers through their bodies made themselves visible to us, to the government, and to the society in general. There have been several studies. This is well known, so I'll spend less time here. There have been several studies, some of which have come out immediately in the wake of the lockdown. Some others very recently, taking a more robust, more systematic approach to data collection. But the broad insight, broad summary that we get from all these studies is that there was a catastrophic drop in the earnings and employment, which of course led to a decline in consumption expenditure, led to increase in food insecurity and hunger. There was a health crisis, not just related to COVID, but otherwise, led to increase in debt burden, because you know that many of the migrant workers had to finance their journey back home and they had to pay astronomical prices to private operators. There were violence, physical, institutional, of various kinds. And initially, the conditions of migrants were not only not known, they were not taken into account in the policy measures in response to the crisis. Subsequently, however, many schemes were announced. Civil society institutions, organizations came forward with various kinds of interventions. But the underlying insight of all these further development are as follows. First, that whatever else we may think about the crisis has shown there exists a vast majority of migrant workers, close to 40 million by some counts, who went back to their villages or places of origin, who simply could not survive an abrupt loss of employment and earnings for a few weeks. So that's the condition under which they live. The second point is that because not enough was known about migrant workers and their conditions, governments had to rely upon the existing structures of programs to advance whatever little help they wanted to advance. So the pre-existing structures of exclusion were very much part of whatever assistance that was given. Not unsurprisingly then, we find not only that there was inadequacy of help when it was provided, but also despite the effort by various state government and the central government, this help did not reach probably the most vulnerable among the migrant workers. So that is something which we should take note of. The third and most significant lesson that we can take from this disruption and in the uneven recovery is that the very fact that this crisis, this visibility of migrant workers and their and some kind of an awareness about, limited awareness about the livelihood crisis that they face, because it happened during the pandemic, during a very abnormal times, there is always the danger of conceptualizing the crisis itself, the livelihood crisis of migrant workers, or at least a majority of migrant workers, a substantial section of migrant workers, conceptualizing that as a temporary phenomenon. there is a danger there. Because if we see what happened during the pandemic, it was not just because of the abrupt nature of the pandemic. So far as the migrant workers are concerned, what happened was also because of the long-term structural features of migration in India. So that is why, even though we are talking in the backdrop of an ongoing crisis, a disruption of livelihood, a slowing down of the economy, in general, the discussion on the crisis of migrant livelihoods must go beyond that, bringing in long-term factors. And that is why policy responses, I believe, should also take into account these long-term factors rather than providing short-term relief. The structural aspects of long-term vulnerability should be at the center of our concern when we are thinking about alternative policy mechanisms. The other point that I want to flag here is that in a period of crisis, migrant workers decided to go back to their villages and to agriculture. The latest PLFS round data, as many of you would know, it suggests that the share of agriculture in employment has increased, reversing a trend which we all know should happen in the normal course of structural change of a developing economy. For years, development economists in India were worried that while the share of agriculture in GDP is coming down, the share of agriculture in employment is not coming down to an appreciable extent. And that was happening, that began to happen. And suddenly, the crisis reversed it. We don't know what will be the long-term implications of such a change at the moment, but it is a sign of distress, and it also signifies, for the purpose of our discussion today, the significance of agrarian changes or agrarian context in understanding the livelihood crisis, not only in the rural areas, but also in the urban areas. I would broadly follow a political economy perspective to understand and to explore the various dimensions of this crisis. Why political economy? As you know, that it is not the mainstream economics approach currently, but it brings with it some advantages, some new insights, I believe. The first thing is that political economy approach explicitly recognizes the possibility of unequal power relations being central to the economy. What happens in the market, what happens in the economy are not separated or cannot be meaningfully separated from the structures of power that govern access to resources, access to capabilities, opportunities, institutions, so on and so forth. So that's the first point. That, however, doesn't mean talking about structural features, talking about long-term changes over which individuals have little control, do not, however, mean an underemphasis of individual agency. Individuals do take decisions, and these decisions do change their livelihood patterns, their future, so on and so forth. But at the same time, we should not forget the contexts, the structural features of the backdrop under which such individual decisions are taken, and the limitations that the structures impose on individual decision making. The other significant aspect of a political economy approach to migration is that we accept that actually existing markets are social institutions in the last analysis. In the final analysis, the fault lines of the society, the differentiations that we see, the differentiations that we see in the society, the social relations of power and powerlessness, all these get reflected in markets, particularly in the labor market. I'll come to the details as we move along. Now, to understand the linkages between agrarian economy and vulnerability of migrant livelihoods, I think three dimensions which are very central to understand the Indian economy in contemporary times as such should be taken into account. The first is uneven development, in particular geographically uneven development. The second is the prolonged agrarian crisis, and the third is the nature of informality of the Indian economy. Uneven development is a feature of contemporary economic development. Particularly, capitalist development is known to create unevenness across space. And we know that there is a long tradition in political economy linking this and talking about the relationship between the center and the periphery, making it a central aspect to understand economic development as a process. What is widely acknowledged is that while in the post-reform period, the growth story of India has been remarkable in comparison to the growth story of many other contemporary economies. There is a rising trend of inter-regional disparities, and only a part of it is captured through interstate disparities. When we are talking about uneven development, we should talk about interstate disparities. But along with that, there are other aspects of regional development or regional disparities that should also be taken into account. And its reflection we see in the broad changes in the migration patterns that we see. There are labor flows, increasing labor flows across regions. Particularly the new labor migration flows that have been noticed by several field studies, and also to some extent it's supported by the available secondary information. We don't have very recent secondary information on secondary data on migration that you know. That from the relatively less developed states of eastern and northeastern India and North India, there are new flows of migration to the relatively developed states and regions, particularly the metropolitan regions. And these are part of the development process. But what is not widely discussed is also that migration flows are influenced by the regional structures of accumulation. Although national economy does give you a good picture of what is happening in the Indian economy, there are distinct regional trajectories, and depending on the character of these growth trajectories, different kinds of demand for labor, employment opportunities are being generated, and accordingly you see a segmented labor flow in the country. Now, let me talk about the agricultural dynamics a little in slightly in greater detail. Studies on migration in India, most studies note the fact that migration flows are incredibly diverse in India. That means what is true at the average may not be true for all the parts. If we are looking at different segments of migrants, for example, domestic workers, for example, construction workers, or we look at the seasonal migrants and the long-term migrants, we find that their characteristics differ. So that is why it is probably analytically a better strategy to look at the conditions under which specific segments of the labor force get incorporated into the migration flows. And one way of doing that disaggregated exercise is look at the political economy of agrarian change. It doesn't provide us with all the answers, but definitely it points us to the conditions, to the starting of the origin areas, the conditions under which people decide to migrate out. Now, agrarian crisis is a word we are familiar with, is a concept we are familiar with. Let me make some comments on the conceptualization itself. Farmer suicides are an extreme manifestation of agrarian crisis. The number and frequency with which it happened tells us a lot about the unequal nature of the post-reform growth process in India. But at the same time, we should also note that it is an extreme manifestation. Absence of farmer suicides doesn't mean an absence of crisis. Sometimes agrarian crisis is seen through the lens of what is happening to productivity in the agricultural sector. There were periods in the post-reform decades where there was a significant deceleration in productivity growth in many regions of India. And people did talk about agrarian crisis in that sense, in a sectoral sense. I would argue that the conception of agrarian crisis should go beyond that, because in some parts and for some crops that productivity has got revived, but there is some kind of a productivity growth, or at least the deceleration has been halted. But that doesn't mean an end of misery, an end of distress for a large number of agricultural dependent households. So how do we conceptualize it? We can conceptualize it as a crisis of survival of those who are dependent on agriculture are located in the rural areas. The 77th round, the situational assessment survey data tells us, the previous round as well as this round, that a substantial majority of agricultural population, farmers, they own tiny pieces of land, and they don't see agriculture as their sole source of livelihood. They simply cannot reproduce themselves as a class depending on crop cultivation alone, or even agriculture and allied sector. So what they do is they try to combine multiple livelihoods just to survive. And this crisis at a global level has been theorized as a crisis of petty commodity production. Commodity production is in political economy terms, is a system of production where the primary purpose of production is to sell it in the market, not for self-consumption. So a goods or services, they become commodity when they are primarily produced for market, traded in the market. But petty commodity production is a system, is a structure of, is a kind of production organization where the means of production are owned by the farmers or the petty commodity producers. They produce in the broad capitalist framework of production organization today, but they are unable to accumulate and expand their size. They remain as producers who own some means of production, contribute their labor, so they are part labor, part capital, but they are unable to expand. This crisis of small and marginal farmers across the world has been theorized as the onslaught of neoliberal capitalism on petty commodity production as a form of production, as an organizational form. In the case of India, it has been discussed in many studies that there is at least partly the crisis of farmers is policy induced. That's not entirely because of the neoliberal reforms, those were introduced post 1990s. There were other factors. Even before that, you will see that in the relatively developed green revolution belt, because of environmental degradation and other factors, the growth rates were already getting stagnant. Climate change is something which has also contributed to the crisis. Destruction of common property resources has contributed to the crisis. But at the same time, if you look at the changes which were brought in as a result of economic reform since 1990s, you would see that farmers are finding that the input prices are increasing, state support is gradually declining. So they are facing a range of input markets where they do not have any control over the prices of these inputs. And the output price fluctuations have increased. So agrarian crisis has got at least two dimensions to it: crisis under backwardness and crisis under commercialization. The first part is well known from our textbooks. We know what agricultural economists to tell the farmers to come out of that low level equilibrium trap. They should go for cash crops, they should cultivate cash crops, they should use the modern inputs, bring in technology, new technology, try to produce crops which will give them a better price, so on and so forth. That might be true for some pockets of India, but for a large part, this is a crisis of growth. This is a crisis of increasing commercialization under very significant, very specific conditions. So as a result of this inability to survive within agriculture alone, agriculture dependent households are forced to diversify. We can pick up two conceptual frames from the classic literature on political economy to make sense of what is happening. What are the conditions under which farmers were leaving agriculture and going to non-agriculture within rural areas or beyond rural areas? Stay with me for a few more minutes on this. The process of disposition, sometimes theorized as primitive accumulation or the ongoing primitive accumulation to be more specific, or accumulation by disposition. These conceptual frames are used to describe the forceful separation of independent producers from the means of production which they own. For example, the means of production that is owned by a farmer is his or her land. And the process of development, neoliberal development, forces changes in policy and in action on the ground, which results in disposition, displacement of some farmers. This is an ongoing debate about how agricultural land should be, allotted to agriculture or non-agriculture, that we have seen. But the key thing is the involuntary nature of it and the use of state power to achieve this objective. I would also draw your attention to two kinds of disposition. One kind of disposition is large-scale abrupt disposition that we have seen in big projects, industrialization projects, real estate projects, and we have seen how mass movements and political mobilization leads to this being discussed in the national media. These we know. But apart from this, there is also a disposition in slow motion. Slow, recurrent disposition happens because the sources of livelihood of rural masses get systematically destroyed, like forest, like land, like water, like other CPRs. And this destruction forces them to realign, to rearrange their livelihood options. The other process, this is one, continued primitive accumulation or accumulation by disposition. People differ on that. I will not go into those details. The other process is quote unquote the normal working of the economy, of the market economy. Most of the farmers in India, as you know, own very small amount of land. It's predominantly a smallholder agriculture. We also know that most of the tenancy is undocumented. And imagine the kind of changes that a gradual capitalist incorporation in agriculture is bringing so far as the small and marginal farmers are concerned. Their interacting in the markets. They are trying to produce cash crops which can be sold in the market at a higher price. But both in the input markets as well as in the output markets, they are facing a situation where they are being marginalized. Unequal exchange is not something which has happened somewhere else. It is happening right there. There are studies which document that when small and marginal farmers interact in these markets, they are systematically at the disadvantages, be it flour, be it cotton, be it other cash crops. They are at a disadvantage because they do not have enough cash also. We know that there are significant changes in the way agricultural credit is accessed in India. Despite all these policy changes, we see that there is a continued dependence on informal sources of credit, high interest sources of credit, not only traditional money lenders, but also the traders, input dealers. From them, farmers are borrowing credit. So this is an agricultural transformation, which is not like the previous round of Green Revolution. You will see that cropping patterns are changing in different regions. But one factor which is new here is that information technology inputs are coming through private sources. And the level playing field is not there. Saying all this means that a substantial section of rural households, those who are particularly at the bottom, are trying to combine other forms, other sources of livelihood. Nearly 40% of the income of farmer households are coming from wages. If you look at bottom, at the bottom of the agrarian structure, this might be more. So labor market within rural areas, within agriculture and outside agriculture, and in some cases in urban areas, has become a part and parcel of the livelihood diversification strategies of agricultural households. Before we move further, let us remember that agricultural households are also differentiated. That means there is diversification at the top, slightly better of households, and diversification at the bottom, who are most vulnerable. Economists talk about survival-induced diversification and accumulative diversification. Accumulative diversification, those who have some surplus from agriculture have realized that there is less possibility of increasing your profits or your or strengthening your livelihood in agriculture. So they have started investing in non-agricultural avenues, in real estate, transport, petty trading, so on and so forth. So agricultural surplus, those who have it, is getting diversified. One source of such diversification is investing in children's education. So that is a way through which accumulative diversification is taking place. At the bottom, however, with very little education, with very little skill, there is a diversification of workers, and this diversification takes them predictably to the urban informal economy. The informal economy is one where there is no social security for the workers, insecure and precarious employment are the order of the day, and also there is multiplicity of livelihoods, meaning not only the workers have to switch between different sectors, different destinations, but many of them also try to combine self-employment and wage labor. Informality is also associated with, although you will see that informality is typically seen as in terms of the regulative capacity of the state, whether a particular farm is registered or not, whether the farm is paying taxes or not. That's one way of looking at informal sector. Another way of looking at it as a form of production and exchange relations, as a system where labor is employed through means which are very different from the standard textbook understanding of the labor market. It is not something, you know, that 90%, more than 80% in some ways of non-agricultural labor is employed in the informal economy. Informal economy is huge in India. We can't take comfort on the fact that gradually it is going to decline. Rather, it is better to see this informality as a characteristics of contemporary capitalism and understand it through in those terms, that the vulnerability that the migrant workers are facing are also partly because of the sector, the way in which they are employed. The informal employment, remember, is not only about the unorganized sector. There is a gradual informalization of formal sector as well. You all know that. So that is how informal employment is the dominant employment that is available to those who are leaving agriculture and coming to urban areas or to different destinations throughout the country. However, this is not the only conceptualization of the linkage between agrarian change and vulnerability. Let us also note that there is another conception of migration which takes note of the voluntary choice of individuals. It is seen more in terms of a response to the changing opportunities in a growing economy. There are economists, for example, who would argue that this migration is something which is in fact changing the livelihood prospects of those who are doomed to a life of survival and struggle in the agriculture sector. They would like to emphasize upon the fact that increasingly the youth are migrating. There is more to it, aspirations, urban life styles, attractions of that, rather than pure economic compulsions. There is also a strong body of literature which points out that remittances might play a very significant role in creating development, particularly in the source areas. How? Because along with movement of labor, there will be a reverse flow. There has been such cases, for example, Kerala, Bangladesh. There are many cases where it has been seen that remittances play a significant role. Not only that there is a flow of money, but also of information and technology to the source areas, and this might change the fate of the areas which are considered backward or less developed. So it is argued that even if the migration is short term, even if the migration is seasonal in nature, it might create a win-win situation, because the urban areas are getting labor which they need, and the rural areas are going to get remittances, and hence this might be a new way of development. Hence, it is celebrated as a market-mediated spatial trickle-down effect of growth. Let me say that there is some evidence, particularly from the last round of NSS data on migration, which supports this, because on an average, studies have found that migrant households, the consumption expenditure of migrant households are better than that of host households. So, and definitely it is better than what they had at the origin areas. So increasingly there is a concern that this might be a positive thing. We must juxtapose this optimism with the reality which we saw during the pandemic. And the explanation probably lies in the unevenness of migration flows, in the diversity of migration flows. Migration on an average is something which we know is a part and parcel of the development process itself. But not everyone are able to access better jobs and more secure jobs. And that is why we are having a substantial population of vulnerable migrant workers. Who are these migrant workers? Who are these vulnerable migrant workers? They are those who are employed as informal workers without social security, maybe self-employed, maybe wage workers. Those who are employed in the formal economy through layers of contractors, middlemen, but they do not have any job security. They do not have any access to social security. There are, of course, the seasonal and short-term circular migrants who migrate out typically during a lean period, work for a few months, and then go back to work in agriculture. Then there are long-term circular migrants who have stayed in the urban areas for long, but they have not got hold of a secure livelihood so far, and then they have not exactly got their connection with the origin areas. They keep on moving back to the origin areas. At the bottom are the bonded laborers who have taken a tired loan and they work off this loan against when they work as migrant workers, as dadan workers working in brick making industry and in some parts of the construction industry. I've done some work in one of such backward regions of the country, and I will not go to the details of what we have found, but let me tell you the broad story. What creates this vulnerability? How exactly people leave their villages and come to work with such uncertainty, such precarity? If you look at the process, you will find that in this particular case, at least, the history of low productive agriculture, the constraint that is imposed by rain-fed agriculture for the survival, denial of CPR, rights to CPR, poverty in terms of access to land, marginalized social status, lack of opportunity to education, and cycles of debt advantage. All these create conditions under which migrant workers, knowing fully well that they are being exploited, still enter into contracts which will probably qualify into ILO's definition of modern slavery. There is unfreedom clearly there, no exit option till the debt is settled, no control over conditions of existence at the destination. You might think that I'm talking about the worst case scenario. Probably I am. But this is the reality under which labor moves from one part of the country to other. At the same time, there is a possibility to reduce such bondage, not through major changes, even small changes, like advancement of irrigation, increasing the area under irrigation, like providing basic consumption credit through SHGs maybe, public distribution system, some kind of employment guarantee, some education, some skills, access to networks. This we have observed has also helped people, migrant workers from the same areas, to move away from debt bondage, to move to relatively better jobs, relatively more secure jobs. In other words, the policy thrust of migration should be not to suppress migration, not to control and restrict migration, not to criminalize migration. Rather, the policy attempt should be to eliminate some of the worst forms of migration, to eliminate vulnerabilities in the migrant workers' worker flows. But let me tell you that a better way to start is to recognize the centrality of rights in an economy. It's clearly a political argument, but then there are clear economic policy benefits if you follow that approach. Having an educated labor force, for example, has got some intrinsic value in any economy. But having a skilled and educated workforce should be seen also as an end in itself. The principle of non-discrimination should be at the core. Let me quickly move to some of the interventions. I will not talk about all the interventions. I'll talk about only some of them, particularly those in relation to agriculture, because when we talk about migration policy, we have to bring in many factors. I don't want to go into all those factors in detail. But then there need to be some immediate short-term measures, but also there is a need to have a long-term perspective. access to livelihood assets, asset redistribution, not very popular today, investment in health, education, and skills could be some of the long-term interventions, which will support alternative livelihoods and which will allow people to access, to bargain at least in the labor market. Migration policy is not about having a set of policies at the destination alone. The interventions which I talked about a minute ago, such as creating a shared prosperity in agriculture. Unfortunately, any kind of agricultural development is not going to create opportunities for all the agriculture dependent households. So care should be taken to make agricultural policy, agricultural development more inclusive, rural non-farm employment, through employment guarantee, through wages, through dependable employment, timely payment of wages, credit support, rural infrastructure development, and finally, a dispersed clusters of labor-intensive manufacturing and other activities. Not something which is entirely impractical, but these would create alternative sources of livelihood for the people in the source areas, so that when they move out with a better bargaining strength. At the destination also will need a variety of policies. Employment creation is one, right? We should confront this question very clearly, that if we are thinking that the structure of the economy is going to radically change in coming years, but it also then we must answer the question, what will happen to those who are leaving agriculture? There has to be a policy thinking, keeping labor at the center, providing through direct and indirect means. The policy options that we have, the constraints that we face as a developing economy can all be debated and talked about. But this objective should be on the table, that labor and employment has to be at the cornerstone of a growth path where we see a degree of structural change which is anticipated in theory. It's not only about creating employment and creating social security. These are being talked about. At the same time, we need targeted policies to eliminate certain forms of discrimination, wage and non-wage discrimination. There is a gender dimension to it, caste, identity, or identities of other kind, ethnicity, language, all these play a role in creating that disadvantage. Let me tell you that there is increasing evidence which is coming that which suggests that the identities of the laborers explain some of these outcomes. You find a concentration of socially disadvantaged group in some of the worst migration contracts, some of the worst migration labor contracts. One way of theorizing it is that because those who belong to socially marginalized groups do not have access to resources, to institutions, so on and so forth, hence it is happening. Careful studies of informal economy also suggest something which goes beyond that. Such identities are not simply a matter of a determinant of the outcomes, adverse outcomes, discriminatory outcomes in labor market. Sometimes these identities structure the labor market. In what sense? If you look at the informal economy, most of the workers, at least a substantial section of the workers, join this through two main sources, through two main channels. One is the channel of contractors, labor contractors, who are connected layers, there are hierarchies among them, and they source labor from the origin areas, bring them to the destination. In many cases, the laborers do not know their ultimate employer. That is why you find, on the one hand, very sophisticated technology employed by multinational firms But at the same time, when it comes to labor contractors, labor relations, they depend on the labor contractors. The second channel through some people migrate out, particularly to sectors like construction, is, for example, through independent migration using the social networks, friends, families, relatives. Both these kinds, in both these kinds of out migration, both these kinds of networks, you find their identities playing a role, not only to access information and jobs, but also to find support at the destination. It is also used to discipline labor, to segment labor, to control labor. So policy should also address this particular form. There has been some talk about universal social security, various components of social security. I think we need a comprehensive one. Some progress has been made towards that end, but there is a large gap between the intentions and the policy instruments which are at the ground. I'll just draw your attention to, again, from the perspective of households who are living partly in agriculture and partly in urban areas, these characteristics of the rights or entitlements, that it should be inclusive, it should be accessible, it should be affordable. There has to be some portability that has been talked about, also divisibility. Part of the entitlement should be there at the origin areas, and if possible, part at the destination. I will conclude now just by drawing a few theoretical, arguments from what we have discussed. The agrarian origins of informal labor points to the conditions under which labor migrate, particularly those who join these vulnerable occupations. And that is why there is a link between what is happening in the urban areas and what is happening in the rural areas. That link is about the reproductive cost of labor. You must have seen in newspapers that migrant workers, when they migrate as a single, particularly as single males, they live in crowded apartments. They try to subsidize the cost of survival so that they can send back as much money as possible to the family back at home. Sometimes migrant families migrate as a family because the cost of reproductions, not just biological reproduction, but day-to-day economic reproduction, the time that is required to fetch water, to cook, to take care of children and old people, they are so high that there is no other option but to live in crowded slums or sometimes in the open just to survive. And that is why it is not possible to leave agriculture altogether. At a time of crisis, we need to go back. Petty commodity production may not be, is facing a crisis, I told you, but it may not be wiped out altogether, despite all these pressure from corporate capital. Why? Because some of these savings which migrants are sending back is being used to give a new lease of life to life in agriculture. Informality is again something which is not going to go away because it helps accumulation of further surplus, and that is why it should be accepted as, or it should be conceptualized as a form of capitalist production, a form of capitalist production where cheap labor becomes our becomes a central part of our links with globalization. Think about this point. There are many ways through which a developing economy in contemporary world can be part of globalization. But what do you bring to the table? Do you want to be part of global capitalism through the process of innovation, by contributing something which cannot be produced elsewhere, or by contributing new technology? Or is it that only through cheap labor you want to remain an attractive destination for global capital? I'll stop here and I'll look forward to your questions. And
thank you so much, sir. That was a really insightful lecture. We definitely understood the agrarian aspects of migration, how root cause of this crisis can be understood by deciphering political economy of agrarian change, and the necessity of policy formation to actually look forward to providing longer term restitution policies. So without further ado, with your permission, I would like to move on to a few questions that we have already received from our audience. And it is a request to all the participants that if you guys have any questions, then you're free to put those questions in the Zoom chat box. So the first question that we've received is, do you think the four labor codes, the Code on Wages, Industrial Relations Code, Social Security Code, and the Working Conditions Code, which are set to replace the 29 labor laws, may deprive workers of many rights that they have won through sustained struggles?
Thank you. The pre-existing labor legislations were not adequate, clearly, to safeguard the rights of the working class in India. However, these set of codes, while saying that they are going to simplify, have also taken away some of the vital rights that was there for workers. One can always debate whether what is better, whether having a set of rights which are never implemented. In the context of migrant workers, for example, there was something called this Interstate Migrant Workmen's Act. But many researchers, including myself, when we go to the field, we see that this never worked on the ground. However, in the changed conditions, in the changed codes, there are many indications, there are many provisions which does two principal, which changes the conditions of work in two principal ways. One is a significant dilution of the bargaining power, collective bargaining mechanism on behalf of the workers, by changing the threshold, by making changes in the body. So when it comes to rights, let us understand this, that having this right to have rights, having these institutional mechanisms to address violations of rights, is something which is very significant to create a level playing field for workers, particularly when we are living in a situation where you know that capital is powerful. The second aspect of it is in terms of social security. Yes, there is a talk about social security. There are provisions that are being talked about to provide a minimum level of social security. What is being promised is not good enough, not adequate enough. Those who have researched on social security, they find that this is not good enough. This is not going to, support, create support structure for the vulnerable workers about whom we are talking. The second point is, there is no time-bound framework for implementation. There are still many gray areas as to who will be responsible for provision of this. There is a declaration of intent, but then the details we need to look for. So in these terms, I don't think that this is going to help in creating a less vulnerable workforce. Thank you.
All right. So next question being, with reference to your research on Assam's tea plantations, how do you think the newly proposed labor codes are going to affect the labor force of Assam and the tea sector as a whole?
Okay, that requires a more detailed answer. But again, another piece of legislation which was already there, the Plantation Labor Act, it did provide a robust set of rights, because plantation sector is special, you know that, because here it is not just the worker, but the family, worker's family as a whole. they are recognized in the structure. So there are health rights, there are rights to education, or there are PDS, so on and so forth, which were the responsibility of the employers. Now, India's tea sector, according to many, went into a crisis, and as normally happens, it was argued that the reason why Indian tea is unable to, compete globally is the high labor costs, and these were this particular piece of legislation was signaled as a stumbling block towards a greater integration of the Indian tea sector. Our research on the ground, however, pointed out that despite strong unionization, I did tell you that unionization is very significant to ensure worker rights, but this is a sector where unions were strong, unionization was very high, but yet the implementation of this act was hardly something which can be called as something desirable. So what was there was clearly inadequate. Now that it will be diluted further, I thought that a better way would be to realign the responsibilities of the state and the tea sector and the owners of the tea estates, rather than completely doing away with the provisions. I do not see, there was already a great deal of violation of the act. For example, rampant casualization. Once you are made casual labor, most of these rights are in any way compromised. Right? Thank you.
All right, so thank you so much. So next question that we have is, like, there have been a lot of related issues such as loss of jobs, lack of access to food, social security protection, health insurance, and other socioeconomic factors, because after migration, these laborers have not been identified by local authorities under the ambit of social welfare programs. How can there be a rapid integration of these masses with the existing natives?
There are already attempts post this crisis. There are attempts at various levels. We have some good and some not so good examples of that. But the dominant framework that is there also in the courts and these actions following the migration crisis is probably through a process of registration using the digital technologies, right? And this has been made in such a way that we are not sure whether, given the digital divide, this is going to create more inclusive structures or more exclusive structures. There is a possibility, however, that this can be further strengthened with participation from local, urban local bodies, gram panchayats, the district governance at the district administration at the source as well as in the destination areas. It can be made a joint responsibility. Registration, the dominant framework seems to be registration. Kerala government, particularly during the phase of this crisis, which has been well documented again, provided something that needs to be done in addition to this framework, where there was a remarkable effort to not only to provide immediate relief, but also even to create awareness in the language of those migrant workers who have come to Kerala. A sustained effort that can be made by creating not just framework for registration. We have some experience on that. The building and other construction workers board, for example, they have a framework for registration even before that. What happens is it needs to be renewed, and that renewal requires certain certified number of days of work in the construction sector, and that process itself creates barriers for those who really are in need of this assistance. Thank you.
All right, so last question. What, according to you, were the economic costs and implications of NHA's decision of waiving off rent charges for migrant laborers?
Sorry, what charges?
waiving of rent charges for migrant laborers.
See, I do not have an estimate on that, but let me answer this by saying that as a society, we need to ask ourselves as to how we need to balance the cost and benefits of policies. That is why I emphasized on the intrinsic value of rights and enhancing capabilities. There are certain decisions, in fact, all these interventions which I talked about, obviously will have a cost attached to it. And you know that in today's situation, it's not easy for a government to generate enough resources to finance those. But it's not impossible either. Within the same, for example, the Building and Construction Worker Fund, which was created by levying a cess on those who are trying to the business houses which are going for construction. It has created a fund. In a situation where everybody talks about lack of fund, you would think that these funds will be immediately used, and this will be used for worker protection, for which there are provisions, clear-cut provisions, institutional structures, and all that. Yet you find there is a great deal of unevenness in the implementation of these funds, and a substantial portion is lying unspent. So my answer to the cost concerns in general would be there would be economic costs, but then there are possible ways of managing those costs, increasing efficiency in institutional management. But as a society, if you think that the lives of migrant workers are important, obviously they are probably moving out, but we need to ask, should this be a preferred way out of poverty or out of agriculture? That should be the question which, on the basis of which as a society we should think about allocating costs and benefits. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving us very patient answers. That's it from our end. Thank you, sir. It was an absolute honor for us to host you. I believe I speak for everyone when I say that we got to learn a lot from the session. On behalf of the Economic Society, SRCC, I extend to you my heartfelt gratitude for taking time out from your busy schedule to be with us today. I would also like to thank the audience for joining us for this enriching session. Thank you so much, sir.